everyone, it is Chris, and I've been looking at damage in the 2024 rules. And in my fighter video, I took a look at sword and board, is what we call it, but long sword and shield. Because growing up, I just found that was an iconic character type. Used to work reasonably well in first edition D&D and second edition D&D, and then in third edition it didn't work so hot, and in fifth edition it didn't work so hot. And what I want to know is, has it improved? Is it actually viable now in the 2024 rules? I did a video a while back, maybe a couple years ago, where I just searched and searched for the best way to make a long sword and shield character work. I came up with a swords bard, I should say. That worked okay. But I'm just wondering if it's more viable now, because of course we've had big changes to the feats and the classes and the weapons. So I was just curious if it would do better. So I did some math for the sword and board fighter in the fighter video, and I screwed it up. So as some of you have noted, from level 8 on, I made a math error that carried all the way through. So what I want to do in this video is I want to correct that math, show you what it looks like on the graph. Then I want to take a look and see if we give the fighter a subclass and a little bit of optimization, how does that change the numbers? And I want to look at the barbarian, because if you look at images of Conan online, some of them will be him with a sword and shield. So I think it's also iconic for that kind of character. I want to see how that looks. And then put it all on the graph, compare it to two-handed builds, as well as to the Warlock baseline, and just see what it looks like. And, we can draw whatever conclusions we're going to draw from that, and I'll draw some conclusions for me from that as well. So just to start out, I'm going to ask, if you are new to this channel and not subscribed, please subscribe. I'm pushing for 100,000. I'm very, very close. So every subscription really helps me out. And it's just a free, easy way that you can support me and this channel. So if you would subscribe, thank you very much. So let's start out with the baseline. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. There it is. So this is what I call the baseline. It's Warlock damage using Eldritch Blast and Agonizing Blast, and very, very simple methods to boost that as much as possible. And I've always used this as a starting point to kind of compare damage to see if the damage is good or not. I would expect damage, even if it's okay damage, to at least meet this baseline, and if it's good damage, it should exceed it by a fair amount. Now, I'm not sure I'm going to keep this as my baseline moving forward, but that's a decision I will not make until I've done a lot of classes and looked at their damage and see where they all sit with each other. Then I'll make a decision on that. So for now, this is still my baseline. So let's go over that sword and board math, and I'll just show you where the error was and show you the corrected numbers. So I'm going to go over this super quick. So this was the fighter that I did the build for. You can see the stuff on your screen, what I gave it. And then here was the math. And here's where I made the error. So on level 8, right here I had figured out what the average damage was at that level. And I was still using 10.5 instead of 11.5 on all these calculations. And I did that all the way down. Everything from level 8 on was wrong. So it has been corrected here. And I'm just going to scroll down so you can see the math. So if I did make another mistake, let me know. But I think these numbers are now correct. And with the corrected numbers, so the uncorrected DPR value, which is take the DPR from the damage per round for all 20 levels, divided by 20, and you get a number. That number is of some value, because it gives you some idea where a build sits in terms of damage, but I would recommend not putting too much value in it, because what it doesn't tell you is when it does the best damage. That is shown in the graph. which I'm going to show you in a second. But I just want to let you know how much of a difference it made. So my uncorrected number was at 22.8, and my corrected number is at 24.5. So a little less than 2 DPR, but it is higher than it was. So here's what it looks like on a graph, and these are now the correct numbers. Blue line right here is the Warlock. The red line, the line that moves around a little bit more, that is the fighter with the long sword. Again, this is no subclass for either. And what I see is in tier 1, so levels 1 through 4, the fighter is pretty much equal to baseline. It shows a little bit lower at level 2 and 3, a little bit higher at level 4, but it's basically the baseline. These are estimates anyways. I would not consider the difference overly significant. Then at level 5, they're basically equal. And then we see the fighter with a longsword starting to increase over the baseline, starting at level 6 by almost nothing. Then a little bit more at level 8. And then it holds the difference up to level 11, and then we see a little bit more at level 13. That's studied attacks coming into play. At level 17, the Warlock gets a 4th Eldritch Blast, so it pulls out ahead and stays ahead until level 19 when we get an Epic Boon feat. And then level 20, of course, we get a 4th attack. So although the Warlock baseline only has a 20.3 DPR value, and this longsword using fighter has a 24 point something. What was it? What did I say? 24.5. We can see just on the graph that in the levels we're actually going to play, right? Like at level 20, yeah, the fighter with the longsword seems to do fine. But the levels we're actually going to play, very little difference from a Warlock using Eldritch Blast. And that's just not very much. So what I wanted to see is how much can we increase that if we were to put a subclass and do a little bit of optimization and see if we can, get these numbers up. So I thought a lot about which subclass to apply. Champion is kind of obvious. I'm not doing Champion, though. If you saw my fighter video, you know what a nightmare figuring out DPR is for the Champion. The easiest one, I thought, was the Psi Warrior, because I could just take, the psionic energy dice and multiply it by the damage boost and divide it by the number of rounds. But it occurred to me that a lot of you probably assume that the Psi Warrior is not your best way to increase the damage. So I decided instead to use the Battle Master. It's a little more complicated. I have to make a few more assumptions. But it's not too bad. It's better than the Champion. So that's what I did. I decided to do a Battle Master fighter. So let me show it to you. Hang on a moment. So it's basically the same build. I just applied Battle Master, and I need to let you know what maneuvers I figured I would take and what I would spend my superiority dice on. And this could change. If it was your character, you might do different things than me. But this is what I would do. And I wasn't just thinking about everything that can boost damage. I was thinking about how I'd actually play this character. Okay? So we have all the same stuff. And then I said Battle Master maneuvers, and I just remind myself here, bonus action available, because one of the advantages of using a longsword over, say, using a quarterstaff and polearm master is we're going to have our bonus action available. In terms of comparing classes to classes, I think that's better because, your bonus action being available to attack is an assumption that it's better if you don't make it for comparison of class to class. Even though Polearm Master does increase your damage overall. The amount it increases your damage does depend on how often you make that bonus action attack or how often you need to use Second Wind, for example. But what I took is at level 3, I took Evasive Footwork. Does not increase our damage, but it's a great maneuver now. Uses our bonus action, but it gives us our superiority die in armor class for an entire round. It also gives us a free disengage, or disengage as part of evasive footwork. I guess it's not free. Then I took menacing attack. I think it's good. The main thing with menacing attack isn't damage. It's frightening the enemy, which is good, but it also increases our damage by a d8. And then I took riposte. And what riposte says is if somebody misses you with an attack, you can use your reaction to attack them. I figure that's pretty good. And if I was a longsword using fighter, I'd probably take that. Level 7, I add ambush. Doesn't increase our damage. I mean, it does. It absolutely increases your damage, but not on these graphs. So ambush, I believe it helps your stealth roll. The main thing I'm going to use ambush for is I can add a superiority die to my initiative roll, which is huge. And in a combat, just think about it this way. Let's say you got a 4-round combat. I talk about initiative because once in a while I hear people say initiative's not as valuable as people say it is. They're wrong. They are wrong. You got a 4-round combat. You ended on the 4th round. If you won initiative, that means the enemy got 3 actions. If you lost initiative, that means the enemy had 4 actions to do bad stuff to you. That's a huge difference. So yeah, I think initiative is very important. And then lunging attack does increase our damage. What it does is gives you it's a bonus action as well. Again, I was happy to take bonus action maneuvers. And you rush towards an enemy, you get a dash, and then you do the extra damage if you hit with your attack. But unlike menacing attack, it's applied before you attack. So there's always a chance you miss and you don't get the D8. So you have to handle those differently in terms of how they impact damage. Level 10, bait and switch, one of my favorites, doesn't increase damage. And then goading attack is similar to menacing attack, except they have disadvantage to attack anyone except for you. I like goading attack because, unlike menacing attack, nobody's immune to goading attack. Menacing attack, if they're immune to frightened, they're immune to the effect. Though technically you can still use menacing attack to get your D8 damage. And then level 15. Level 15 is a special level for Battle Masters in the 2024 rules. What they get is on any turn, they get a D8 they can spend for any maneuver. So Rally, which gives temporary hit points, is an obvious pick at level 15 because out of combat, you can just do it, right? And give everybody a bunch of temporary hit points. And you might use it in combat. But out of combat, I think Rally is going to be great at level 15. And then Precision Attack. And that's where if you miss, you can add a superiority die and potentially turn your miss into a hit. Doesn't add to the superiority die to the damage. Just adds to your chance to hit, but it does end up increasing damage. So here's how I kind of predicted I would spend the dice, and this would depend on the session, but these are guesses. So die usage at level 3, we're going to have 48, and I said let's do one of each maneuver that we have per short rest, and randomly one of them will be done one extra time. And then I am going to assume there's a 20% chance that we're going to add menacing attack to a critical hit. I think you're more likely to use menacing attack when you get a critical hit because you're looking for dice to double, right? So that's why I'm giving it a higher percentage. And just the menacing, this is the equation. It's 4.5 times 1.2 divided by 8 rounds of combat times 1.33, right? Because we might use it the one extra time. And riposte, here's the equation. It's just one attack plus a d8 damage divided by 8 rounds of combat times 1.33. Okay, level 7 we get an extra die, so we now have 5 dice. So I assume one of each maneuver per short rest because we now have 5 maneuvers. 5 dice, 5 maneuvers. And there's the equations for menacing and lunging and riposte because those are the only ones that add to damage. Level 10, we're going to go up to 5d10. So same number of dice, but we now have a d10, so it changes our equations a little bit. And then level 15, so we're going to get 6 dice and the extra 1d8 per turn. I assume that we will use riposte a quarter of the time. And basically, riposte, we'll use it whenever we can. If an enemy misses us, we will use riposte because we can use the d8. And it's not going to affect our usage on our turn at all. So I would always use that free d8 to do my ripostes. And then menacing, lunging, and precision. Precision, we have some guesswork because so you make a roll, DM announces you miss. You may know how much you miss by. You may not know how much you miss by. It all depends. Like, have you figured out what the enemy armor class is yet? Sometimes the DM will tell you what the enemy armor class is. Certainly in the rules, there's nothing saying they should do that, but I sometimes do it. It's just, you're playing a casual game. So then you have to, like, even if you figure out how much you miss by, if you miss by 4, do you use precision attack? Well, it might work and it might not work, right? I assumed it's going to turn a miss into a hit 75% of the time. All that, what I just said, comes down to I had to make a guess, and I said 75% of the time precision attack gets us a hit. And I assume that the D8 per turn used for damage 50% of the time. In other words, sometimes I'm going to use it on evasive maneuvers or something like that that isn't going to increase our damage, and sometimes I am. And I figured maybe 50-50. All right, level 18, our base dice go to D12s, and we're going to have 6 of them, and there's your calculations. And yeah, so let's go through it. So 1 and 2 won't change. And then at level 3, you can see I made it yellow. I just made it yellow to remind myself every time that maneuver dice change, I made it yellow so I wouldn't forget, because I didn't want to go back and do another video of corrections. All right. And you can see the math. It's 9.0, 11.4, 18.7, 20.2. It actually goes down at level 7 because we have another maneuver that doesn't do damage that we're doing sometimes. But it basically stays the same. 20, 23.1, and up to 23.2 at 10. That's not a big increase. Level 11, 32.2. Then 33.6 at 13. 38.2 at 15. That's a big jump because, again, that Battlemaster feature that they get at 15 now is really, really good. 38.2 at 16. 41.3 at 17. 41.6 at 18, 48.3, and then 62.6 is our final level 20 number. And the number we get for a DPR value is 28.2. And let's look at it on the graph. So 28.2 sounds a lot better than 24.5, right? It's a jump of what, about 4, a little less than 4. But if we look at the graph, look where the gap is. Okay, so the bottom line is the Warlock. The middle line is the fighter without a subclass. And then the upper line is the fighter with Battlemaster. And what I see looking at this is, as expected, at level 3, the Battlemaster always does more damage than not having a subclass. Of course it does. But it doesn't do very much more damage until we get to 15. At level 15, we get a big gap, and that gap kind of holds right to level 20. So that's where your almost 4 DPR of the DPR value is coming from, primarily levels 15 through 20. The other levels, the difference is much smaller. If I'm just looking at my notes here, looks like about 2 to 2.5 generally for DPR difference between a Battlemaster and not being a Battlemaster. Now, you might play your Battlemasters differently than me. You might look at my, evasive maneuvers and bait and switch and go defenses for losers. And so maybe your number would be higher. But if I was playing the Battlemaster, those are the maneuvers I'd probably take and probably use them the way I suggested. And I would not see a big increase to damage for being a Battlemaster. And ironically, just for funsies, I took the Battlemaster numbers out and added in the Psy Warrior damage. I didn't do all 20 levels, so I'm not going to bother presenting it, but it's basically the same as the Battlemaster. Very much lockstep. I could have done it, and it would have been easier math, and it would have been a similar result. But there's the Battlemaster for you. I don't think that's very good if I want to do a lot of damage, because until I get to level 15, I'm still hardly above a Warlock. And as I've mentioned in this series, I'm probably changing that baseline because I think it's probably too low with the 2024 rules. So my new baseline might even be above what the Battlemaster can do at most levels. I'm fairly confident once we get to level 15, then we'd be beating even a revised baseline. But 15 through 20, those aren't the levels I'm normally playing when I play D&D. And at the levels I do play, I'm just not seeing an increase here. Now, there's quality of life stuff that we're getting. The sap mastery doesn't add to this damage, but it's nice defensively. Same thing with things like evasive maneuvers, really nice defensively, but they don't. If damage is part of what I expect to do, and it is, this does not impress me. So, what I wondered was, is the Barbarian going to be better? And I think it is. So what I'm showing you up on screen right now is the Warlock baseline at the bottom, and then we have two lines, and they switch places. The green line is the Barbarian two-handed build using a greatsword. The red line is a fighter without a subclass using a greatsword. So these are very comparable builds. Just one's a Barbarian and one's a fighter. And what we see is from levels 1 through 10, the Barbarian outdamages the fighter. And from levels 11 and up, the fighter outdamages the Barbarian. The levels I expect to play most often are those levels that the Barbarian is outdamaging the fighter. And it's interesting, again, I talk about DPR values. The DPR value of the Barbarian was 33.4, and the fighter was 36.2. So the fighter is a fair bit ahead in DPR value, but if I was playing these two builds, most of the games, I would expect to do more damage with the Barbarian. So that's, once again, why I do these graphs rather than just give you a number, so you can see exactly when and where each one performs better. And the thing is the fighter gets a third attack at level 11, and it's big. And then they get a fourth attack at 20, and that's big too. The Barbarian doesn't get those. But what the Barbarian does get helps him out at those levels 1 through 10 a lot more than what the fighter gets. Mainly reckless attack. Reckless attack, it plays big. Now, I should also remind you that just because the Barbarian can generate their own advantage doesn't mean the fighter will never have advantage, and these numbers assume they don't. These numbers may not be as far apart as they appear to be. Nevertheless, looks to me like the Barbarian does quite well at those earlier levels. And furthermore, we got two subclasses with Barbarian that improve damage. So with World Tree and Wild Heart, I'm always getting those two mixed up, but World Tree and Wild Heart, the green line here is the damage you would do if you applied those subclasses as well, because neither of them add to damage. Zealot and Berserker are the two that do, and I did in my Barbarian video. You can see the Berserker did the most damage of anything I've done up to now. Well, the Zealot did not do as much damage, but it does more damage than other Barbarians. I wanted to look at Sword and Shield for both of them and compare it to the fighter's sword and board and see how they do. Now, rather than go through one and then put it on the graph and go through another, we'll put it on the graph. I'm going to go through both builds, and then we'll look at both of them on the graph, okay? They're basically the same build, except one's a Zealot and one's a Berserker. And yeah, so what did I do? Didn't worry about species for any of these. There's my ability scores. And my ability score increases. I take Sentinel at 4, Strength +2 at 8, Charger at 12, Mage Slayer at 16, Boon of Irresistible Offense at 19. And somebody mentioned to me that Boon of Irresistible Offense, one thing about the Boon of Combat Prowess that turns a miss into a hit that's very nice is if we are using Brutal Strike, which is the level 9 feature that gives you a D10 damage, but you give up advantage on the attack. And then, you can push them, you can slow them, and at higher levels, you can do other stuff as well. And eventually, you can do multiple things with a single Brutal Strike, and you can do it once on your turn, so on one of your 2 attacks. And I would generally use it on the first attack. And one thing they mentioned is Boon of Combat Prowess actually plays really nicely with that, because that's your important attack, and you can basically guarantee it hits. And that's true, and that was mentioned to me after I did all these calculations. I'm just keeping it Boon of Irresistible Offense. If you were to take Boon of Combat Prowess, you'd see a bigger jump at 19. And yeah, I don't think it matters, right? I'm not playing level 19 that much. Charger is a feat that I mentioned in a previous video I'm fairly disappointed with. I do think it's nice on a Barbarian after level 9, because if we do our Brutal Strike and we do the push, then we can follow them using half our movement speed and make our next attack, which we can apply Charger to. We can only apply Charger once around, but it just means it's going to be a lot easier to use Charger than if you don't have that kind of option. So I think we can get more out of it. So I make some assumptions. I said Frenzy works if we hit at least once on our turn using Reckless Attack. This is the chance of a critical for a Frenzy. I went over this in my last video. I said Charger is available for the first attack 50% of the time. That's what I've been assuming with all these builds. But I also say Charger is available after a Brutal Strike push 50% of the time. In other words, if we didn't use it on our first attack, which is 1 out of 2 times, then it would be available after Brutal Strike. So Sentinel provides a reaction attack 25% of the time. I said once we get Retaliation with the Barbarian, then basically if the enemy attacks us, we're going to get a reaction attack. If the enemy attacks somebody else, we're going to get a reaction attack. Basically, unless the enemy does something other than attack, we should get a reaction attack. I said that'll happen 75% of the time because sometimes enemies do other stuff. I assume same assumptions for everything else. I assume that we're raging on round 1. Yeah, Brutal Strike on first attack. So here are the calculations, and basically on the left side are just features that I've reminded myself. The DPR calculations are on the right, and we go from 5.9 to 8.5 to 15.1 to 18.2, 28.5 stays the same, 30.6 at 8, 35.7. Big jump at 10 because we add Retaliation. So we go up to 41.2 and 44.1 at 12 once we add Charger. 44.1 at 13. 49.6, that's level 16. Level 17, Brutal Strike gets better. 53.2. 53.2. 57.8. And 67.4. And there's one other thing I want to mention. And I should show you the math. So this is when we get Brutal Strike. In the Barbarian video, using a two-handed weapon, I determined that Brutal Strike and a attack with Reckless. So Brutal Strike, we add a D10, but we don't get advantage. Reckless, we don't add a D10, but we do get advantage. And I determined that the Brutal Strike does a little bit less damage. It's very, very close. Close enough that I wouldn't worry about it. If you want to do Brutal Strike, don't worry about your damage. But it does a little bit less, just because you hit enough less often that on average we do less damage, despite the D10. With a longsword, that's not the case. With a longsword, we do more damage with our Brutal Strike. We can see 10.8 and 0.5 on a critical. Well, with Reckless, it's 10.5 and 0.5. And so, yeah, it ends up being a little bit more. So I would use Brutal Strike all the time. And with a longsword character, I'm using the Brutal Strike anyways, because I know this isn't, my best damage option for a weapon. I want to do other stuff. And I love that Barbarians can do other stuff now than just do damage. Not just with the Weapon Mastery, because we're doing SAP, which is on their first attack, basically canceling out the advantage we gave them by attacking recklessly. That's nice. But then we're also doing the Brutal Strike. So I really like that. Anyway, I thought that was interesting that the math turned out that Brutal Strike is always worth doing now. I mean, it will depend on the armor class of the enemy. Always worth doing with the assumptions that I've made. Anyway, that's the Berserker. And with a Zealot, I did the same build. Okay, by the way, 37 is the DPR value. So, Sword and Board Zealot. And I said it's Longsword Conan by Crom, because we're a Zealot, right? And yeah, it's the same build. And did I make any differences on my assumptions? Not really. It's basically the same assumptions. I didn't have to account for retaliation. Is the only difference. We go from 5.9 to 8.5 to 12.7, 16.6, 26.6, 27.6. Stays the same. Then 30.7 at 8. Level 9, 32.5. Just like with the Berserker, it makes no difference. Brutal Strike's worth doing. 33.4. 37.2. 38.2 at 15, 16, we're up 40.7. Level 17, the Brutal Strike improvement, 44.3, 45.3, 48.9, and we finish off at 57.9, DPR value of 32.2. That's a lot less, right? DPR value, I said, was 37 for the Berserker, I believe, right? Let me verify that. Yeah, 37.0, 32.2. Huge difference. Let me show you on a graph. Line at the bottom is the Warlock. Pretty much the bottom almost all the way. At level 2, it's not at the bottom, but pretty much the bottom all the way across. The red line, the line in the middle, is the Fighter. And we can see at level 20, it jumps ahead. But from levels 2 through 19, it is below. It's pretty close at 19, and it's pretty close at 15. In fact, I think they're basically equal at 15. It's also very close at 11. In fact, from levels 11 through 20, those two lines aren't that far apart. Where they are far apart is levels 5 through 10. Those are the levels I'm going to play at. Those are the levels that I'm going to see the most play, and I'm seeing a huge improvement by using the Longsword and Shield with the Zealot. Now let's throw the Berserker on here, and I'm going to make an observation. So we got 4 lines. Bottom line is the Warlock. The next line up is the Fighter. Then the next line up is the Zealot. And then the top line is the Berserker. The Berserker, like I said, had a huge DPR value increase over the Zealot. But look at level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. These two characters do basically the same amount of damage. There are slight differences, but barely statistically significant. So whether, take a look at the Berserker, take a look at the Zealot, whichever one looks more fun to you or better to you, go ahead. In terms of damage, virtually no difference. Now, personally, the reason I mention this is because the more I've dived into the 2024 rules for the Barbarian, the more I like the Zealot. And it might be because I get saving throw rerolls. I know there's Charm and Frighten immunity for the Berserker, but a lot of saves you make are not against Frightened or Charmed, and Zealot just kind of covers all of it, and I really like that. Also, like they get the healing dice, especially at lower levels. So I actually prefer the Zealot. I think if I was going to make a long sword and shield build, I would do a Zealot. In fact, I have done a long sword and shield build with a Zealot, and I'll be playing it on the D20 Play channel, and it should already be out by the time this video becomes public. And I did a halfling because I was going to do a halfling, and I did longsword and shield, a Zealot, and Shield Master. And what I figure is if I get hit with something like a fireball, I have a decent chance of turning it to 0 damage. We're playing at level 6, by the way, which means that rogues can't and monks can't yet, but I can potentially take 0 damage from area of effect dexterity. I like the idea of that. And these damage calculations are part of the reason I made that character, because I figure looks solid to me. For example, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to remove because it's getting cluttered, I'm going to remove these lines. I'm just going to take the Zealot with longsword and shield and compare it to a Barbarian. So this would be a World Tree Barbarian or a Wild Heart Barbarian with a 2-handed sword and Great Weapon Master, and compare the two. So your bottom line is the Warlock, right, which is left in the dust. The other two lines, and it almost doesn't matter which color is which, does it? But one of them is using a 2-handed sword with a Barbarian that either doesn't have a subclass, or you chose World Tree, or you chose Wild Heart. That's the damage you would do. And the red line, the other line, is the Zealot with a long sword and shield. The green line I said red line. Green line is the Zealot with the shield. It does do less damage from levels 5 through level 11, but not a lot less. Like, these two lines are very close all the way through. So almost doesn't matter what tier of play you're playing at. It looks to me like the longsword and shield barbarian is about as good as one with a great sword if we choose Zealot instead of one of the subclasses that doesn't increase damage. And of course, is that worth it? Well, that really depends on you, because World Tree and Wild Heart are getting other stuff, right? It's not like they don't get anything. They just don't get damage boosters. And World Tree gets some great stuff. So you have to look at the whole package and see what you want to play. But it looks to me like you could choose whichever one sounds better to you, and you're going to get very similar damage. And I like that. I like that quite a bit, actually. So I'm pretty happy with where this ended up. And I think if I wanted to play a longsword and shield using character, I'd consider the Zealot very closely. Now, I haven't done sword and shield for Paladin yet or Valor Bard yet, and those numbers might be very different. And so once I'm done this whole process, maybe the Zealot isn't the best. But based on the classes I've gone over so far, it looks to me like the Zealot is a good choice. And Berserker is a good choice too, especially if you're at higher levels. But from levels 1 through 10, Berserker, Zealot, whichever one you prefer, and the damage, you should expect it to be about the same. Okay, so that is Sword and Board. I wanted to talk about it because I was having a lot of thoughts about it and doing a lot of math on it, and I thought I would keep you guys informed on where my head is going. But I do want to get into more damage calculations for different classes. So in my next video, I think I'll do the Paladin next, because we've had changes to Smite, of course. We've had changes to Divine Favor, the spell. And I want to just see how the Paladin looks compared to the other classes I've done so far, because I'm curious. So that's the one I'm going to do next, but there will be more classes to follow. So I hope you will join me for that. Otherwise, till next time, I am going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thank you, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.